weekend. So thank you. So thanks again for joining this evening, as Martin had mentioned, and thanks again to the Donegal Local Development Company for having me on board. I would much prefer to be in Donegal with you all, but I think webinar is what I'll have to do for the moment. My area of focus is twofold. So Living Legacy is an organisation that actually helps individuals focus on kind of the planning of the what ifs, and organisations as well, looking at things like succession planning, end of life planning, advanced planning. The whole focus really of this is to ensure that you're really taking stock of where you're at right now, getting a guidance on the plans that you need to put in place, and then looking at what you actually want to achieve going forward. So sure. This is actually to take away, I suppose, the fear of planning for those kind of scenarios, is actually to say, no, this is a really positive thing, because it actually allows you to really honor all of the great things that you've done to date. I will ask if everybody can put themselves on mute, because unconscious people have background. So if you can all just make sure to put yourself on mute if possible. I think I'm going to try and mute a couple of people here. If at any point I'm speaking too fast or you can't understand anything that I'm saying, please just let me know. I'm never going to apologize for my being a dub, but sometimes I get carried away in the speed of which I speak. So please feel free to let me know if you want me to slow down. I see that there are a couple of people joining us now, so welcome. This presentation is going to take about 35 to 40 minutes. There is time then afterwards for a Q&A, and I will talk then about the workshops that will actually follow for the next 3 Mondays. Does anybody have any questions now, just before we begin? Everybody okay? So please feel free to put into the chat if you have any questions, and we'll work through it. But for now, we will get started. So just bear with me 2 seconds now. Okay, can everyone see that okay? Okay, great. So welcome this evening. So today's webinar is focusing on mastering your succession. So again, the ideal of design, develop and deliver your group succession plan. I'm going to go through various considerations. So I would ask if you have a pen and paper just to take some notes. This presentation is being recorded and will be shared with you. I have a pre-recorded version as well. And again, it's just so, rather than just giving you the slides, is to actually have me talk through it to help identify any of the issues. So again, looking at this then with regard to succession planning, when you're thinking about succession, ultimately it's looking at who benefits from what you do. So there's a reason why your organization, your committee, your community group was created. Why? Who was it that was actually going to benefit? And how were they actually going to continue benefiting in the long term, regardless of who is in the organization doing the work? When we think about actually all of the different stakeholders that are connected to your work, there's a range of people, there's a range of organizations. You've got your team, ultimately, are the ones carrying out the work, to society at large. How does your work influence and help other people that has a knock-on effect then to their wider networks as well? We look at people like your stakeholders, such as your suppliers, your board, your members, volunteers. Everybody has a part to play in your organization's success, as well as you have a part to play in their fulfillment. You then have your clients and your extended community. So there's so many different stakeholders that are really impacted by what you do. But when we look at what does your organization have, a succession plan is key. And the reason being is, my understanding is that there are many committees and community groups that are here because you have recognized a gap. You've recognized that there's a need. But you can't do it alone. And ultimately, we each are impacted and rely on other people. So how do we ensure that we put a plan to future-proof what we do? Why succession planning is important for your organization is, I suppose, kind of, varied. The key things that I would say is you need to constantly remind yourself the importance of your vision, your mission, your values. And then ultimately looking at preparing for the what ifs, whether that is people leaving the organization, people dying, different scenarios within the wider world that can impact what you do. And then ultimately to build your legacy. So when you actually think, whether you are the founder of the organization, you're creating a legacy by the work that you're doing. So how do you ensure that you're honoring not only your legacy, but the legacy of everybody that is impacted and influenced by the work that you do? So again, looking back at those key components, when we look at the vision, why was the organization created in the first place? What was your mission, your values, and your people? And I'm going to go through these in more detail now, but really to factor in your team. How are they going to lead the organization into the future? What are the systems and practices that you do that actually really work? Maybe what ones don't? What's your strategy? How is your mission actually executed? And then ultimately, your vision. Who are the beneficiaries that really benefit from what you do? So, in preparing for the what ifs, always think about the things that you have experienced so far, and then obviously the unforeseen. We've all come through a pandemic. We've all had different situations where people may have gotten sick. There may have been different factors that have actually affected us. So, again, health and wellness is key. But what happens if we don't have health and wellness, or there are other factors that impact the work that we're doing? We have weather and climate change. We've got everything from floods to droughts. We have, things that affect our supply chains as well. And again, going back to climate change, my understanding as well is within your communities that there's a huge focus on food security, food supply, community engagement. How does weather and climate change impact what you're doing? Death, unfortunately, is something that happens to us all. But how are we prepared that if we have somebody that may have died, whether they are kind of elder in age or whether there's been an accident, do we have an understanding of the value and the work that they brought to what we do? Do we have documented the Bible of the work that they did? How do we know that if we need somebody to step in a moment's notice, that we're prepared? Funding and finance then is key. We can't actually do all of this without the funding and finance to back it up. So how do we ensure that, are we prepared if a funding stream is taken away from us, if finances are low, if we've actually overspent, how are we looking at actually managing all of that? So again, these are all of the what ifs. This is not a guaranteed when, but this is the what ifs. How prepared are we? We then look at where we have people that may be exiting the organization. People do leave, people move on to actually go on and explore different career paths. But people may also have fulfilled the remit of what they intended to do, and it's time for them to move on. We also have people that come into the organization. So how do they actually bring in new change, new energy? And then ultimately, competitors. Who else is out there doing what we do? Are they impacting the work we do? Can we learn from them? Do we have opportunities to collaborate? And do we have ways that we can improve what we do by actually seeing how they get things done? So when we're looking at things like legacy, ultimately it's on an individual basis, but also collectively. What is the legacy that you want to live and leave for others to follow? And I will stress the impact in terms of the word live. This is not about the after you've gone, after you've left, after you've died. Actually, what can you do to really engage with the legacy that you're building now? We all talk about things like the power of one. It's one person taking those steps that can actually influence so many more. So what are the things that you have done that have already created a legacy and have really had positive impact for other people? So this is where Living Legacy comes in. So we look at blueprints for successful succession planning. We would always say start early, but if you haven't started early, then start now. How can you look at identifying people that may have the potential to take over from you, may have the opportunity to strengthen what you do? Do you have clear goals in terms of your succession? Like, what's your vision for a successful succession planning and implementation? And then documenting everything. Do you have that Bible of your organization, of your community group? Do you have it clear in terms of your systems, what you're doing, why you're doing, when, and how? So one of the things that I would say is when we're trying to look at an effective succession plan, I would put it down into 10 steps. How to future-proof your organization. What is it that you actually see as to the long-term vision of your organization that you're looking beyond yourself? Taking stock, and I don't mean taking stationery, but I actually mean is taking stock of where you're at now as an organization, as a group, as an enterprise. What's working, what's not working, who's involved, and where are there gaps or where are changes needed? Your values and culture. And quite often, these are the things that can often be the block to success, but they're also the things that quite often we take for granted. What are the values that drive you all forward? How do you actually treat each other? How do you engage with your wider communities? What's the culture, the behavior, the practices within the organization, within the team itself? What are the tools? What tools are you using to actually look at that kind of business continuity focus? Are you looking at the what ifs? Are you looking at your strategy? Are you looking at not only your plan A, but your plan B, your plan C? Then moving more into the succession planning and the succession mapping. You may be a small group, you may be a larger group, but you all know people and you've all come across different networks. Who has potential, both internally and externally, to lead what you do in the future and for the long term? How are you supporting them? How are you identifying what supports they may need? How can you develop mentoring supports as well so that they're learning from the vast knowledge that you each have? Looking then at new recruits. How do you identify where there are gaps? If you all look at like long term, you have your strategic plan, whether that's for 2, 3, or 5 years. There are certain things that you want to achieve, but you may not necessarily have the skill set internally within your group to achieve it. So how do you identify the skill set that you need and when to actually bring those people or those roles in? Because ultimately, again, as I said, we can't do it alone. Some people come and go, but we also need to bring in new energy, new ideas, new expertise. The next element then is timelines and budget. So again, how do we schedule and plan, and how do we fund it? Do we have the money to pay for the recruitment? Do we have the money for the high potential development? Do we have the funding to get the tools that we need? And then ultimately, how we prepare that to hand over our vision. So when we're ready to then go, it's time for us to step away. How are we working with that next generation to then take over and enhance what we've done to lead it forward into the future? The next thing, which I feel is probably the most important one, is accountability. Not only in terms of how you assess the succession planning, but how you actually assess every person's contribution to what you're doing. How are you accountable as a leader? How are your team accountable? How are your board accountable even, and your volunteers? But also, how is the plan accountable? How do you know that you're actually doing everything that you said you were going to do? And then the next steps. These are the things that I will talk about with regard to the masterclasses as well. So point one then, future proofing, and it's really to look at those things. What are your risks? How prepared are you for the risks? And maybe what are the things that have been unforeseen in the last 5 years that you've learned so much from to actually ensure that if you hit another block in the road, that you're able to actually work through it or work around it. Your systems and best practice. Do you have things documented? Have you even looked at what your systems are? Do you look at how things can be improved? Stakeholder assessment. Now, this is something that I would recommend that you do, is actually do a survey. Talk to your suppliers, talk to your clients, talk to the people that are engaged with you, talk to your funders. How do each actually experience the work you do? How are you looking at planning for your leadership, your critical role developments, which I'll touch on in a few more slides? How do you identify your future skills need, passing on that knowledge, but also ensuring that continuity of service to your communities? So this is where I would refer to, as I'd said earlier, in terms of taking stock. And you'll see there's a picture that says, before you finish, start. So again, it's that thing of before you get to the end of your strategic plan, before you get to retirement, before you get to the conclusion of what you're working on, start to look at what you're doing. Look again at your risk assessments, your systems review, your employees or your volunteers. How is everyone engaged? How do they actually understand and really, I suppose, embody the values? What tools are being used? How often do you review your strategy? And then how do you identify the gaps in your offering and the skills that you need to actually help you achieve what you've set out to do? When we look at this, is how do you all engage? Both as the leader, as part of a team, as individuals, as service providers, and as colleagues. Because ultimately, everybody has their responsibilities, their vision of how they think things should be done. But are they all aligned to the bigger picture? Are you all, as such, singing off the same hymn sheet? When was the last time, as a collective, you sat down to discuss what works, what doesn't work, and what solutions are being proposed and how to actually put them forward? Then have you engaged with your team as to what your purpose is? Do your team actually know what the mission is? Now, everybody may be used to, having 2 or 3 lines and being able to say it off the top of their head. Do they actually properly understand it? How engaged is everyone with the strategy? Does everybody understand the purpose of their role and the role that they play? How accountable are they for the performance? Are they part of the solution? Are they part of the problem? How accountable are they being held? And do they know their future? Do they feel that they're going to stay long term with you? Do they have aspirations to do other things? Do they even know what your aspirations are for them in the long term? So again, it's that piece of communication to really sit down and to discuss it. Might be difficult conversations, but actually once it's had, it makes things much easier to see how collectively you are aligned. So this would be what I feel is one of the most important aspects is your culture and your values. So again, when you think of values, it could be anything from, you're setting out to look after your beneficiaries. You've identified a gap. You want to make sure that everybody has access to food, access to amenities. But actually, how are you engaging with it? Are you doing it with kindness, with empathy, with love, with engagement, with accountability, with trust? When was the last time that you actually all sat down to say, what are our values as a group? You may have values yourself as an individual that you feel are very much part of the organization, but actually, are you all in sync as to what the values of your collective actually are? How do you define the organization through your values? What is your organization's culture? And again, when I say organization, I also mean community groups. I mean social enterprise. I mean committees. How do you actually define the culture and the values of you as a collective? How are they actually put forward in terms of the behaviors of your leaders? How are your values and your culture embedded in your practices, in your shared beliefs, the assumptions? How do other people experience the culture and the values? And again, whenever we have collective communities, there will always be that sense of some people might feel that, what they want to do, other people aren't paying attention to. We've all come across where there's toxic work cultures. How do we actually address that? And quite often when you're coming into a space, especially of nonprofits, and I've, been involved with several nonprofits myself, is that level of passion. When people have the passion and they have that firm belief as to what they should be doing or what the group should be doing, sometimes it can actually come with a toxic element because everybody's coming at it with their own very clear vision, but they're not prepared to see the others. How do we actually get everybody to sit down and engage to really talk about, well, maybe there are certain behaviors that aren't appropriate. Maybe there are certain things that need to be brought in. How is the culture and values, how are they really lived through in the behaviors of the individuals and the group? And how are they experienced by everybody within the group and outside of the group? Because sometimes they can actually be the biggest blocks to progress. So in looking at how do you live your values, how engaged are people into the why? Do they believe in it? Are they really understanding on the how? How accountable are they for the what? And what I mean by that is in terms of for the work that they actually do, how they do it, what they do. Does everybody know the environment? And I mean in the sense of some people may be experiencing the work culture as one thing, and other people may be just head in the sand and want to engage with it. They may not necessarily effectively understand the wider communities that you're serving. So how do people know and engage with the environment and the communities that you serve, including the community that you're a part of within the team? What supports are there for a team? Now, I know for bigger organizations, they may have like employee assistance programs. There may be different mentoring supports. There are, tools out there that you can avail of. So it can be the wheel of fantastic programs. There's mentoring programs and opportunities through the Carmichael Centre. There's obviously great supports through the Donegal Local Development Company. So there's different organizations that can provide supports both in terms of training and development, mentoring, but also leadership development and support as well. So make sure to be aware of what's available to you. And then how do you actually account for the integrity throughout the work that you're doing as a collective and beyond? Is it clear, and are you addressing any issues as they arise? Is there a hesitancy in terms of dealing with conflict or even dealing with things like succession? How do we ensure that we're actually true to the integrity of the very reason that the organization or the mission itself exists? Here are some tools just to give you a bit of I suppose, a starter. So you can do things like, the personality to better understand personality types, behavior types. So there's the Myers-Briggs, and you may have come across, people are INTJs and, different things, but actually it's all well and good using the acronyms, but what do they mean? There's Belbin as well, which looks at team roles. So again, you cannot have everybody behaving in the same way or coming at it from the same angle. You've got people that could be the initiators of ideas, people that follow through, some are observers, some shape the actual work that gets done, some are there as kind of conflict resolution. What part does everybody play? So there are surveys and there are different tools that you can get online and access to. There's one that I would recommend as well, which is David Cantor's Reading the Room. Now, it's a massive book, but he had created the Cantor Institute. And in that, there's a different kind of psychometric testing that you can do to better understand the part you play within an organization, within your personal life. And it's a really interesting insight. It's used by an organization called CAN, which is the Community Action Network. Some of you may have come across them. They do amazing work, and they do this brilliant program with the wheel called the Transformational Leadership Program. If you haven't yet got on that program, I would strongly recommend that you do. I undertook it. I just thought it was an absolute game changer. But again, it's an opportunity to better understand yourself, but also to better understand the people that you work with and work for. The last thing as well, which is when I first saw it, I thought it was the funniest thing, which is a book called Surrounded by Idiots. And quite often that can be something that we all collectively feel when we're in a group. But it is a book that actually talks about the different kind of behavioral types. So again, it's along those lines of the personality types. What type of person are we? How do we engage? How do we understand? How do we receive information? How do we impart information? And I think quite often it's a good way to better understand not only ourselves, but the group that we're a part of and the communities that we serve. So there's a few things there that I think could be a good opportunity to check into. So now looking specifically at the succession planning, there's a couple of things I'm going to work through here with you. And these are the elements that I touch on in more detail in the masterclasses, which are on over the next 3 weeks. So when we look at your, I suppose, org structure, so when you actually look at the structure of your committee, of your social enterprise, of your organization and your community group, there are kind of 3 elements to look at within the actual structure itself, and they are the roles. So we can have critical roles. These are probably 10 to 15% of your roles. And they're really the ones that are key. The organization or the community group cannot function without. Now, this is not an ego-driven element. This is more about the practical aspect of the role itself. So you may have where it could be a chair, it could be a general manager, it could be a finance person, but there's somebody that is key to ensuring that you actually are fulfilling the remit of what you've set out to do. They're key in terms of bringing in revenue. They have specialized skills. And they're both probably the high level in terms of they're externally visible to the public, but they're also internally like high level within the team. We then go on to the core roles. So these are the ones that are essential for the kind of execution of your strategy. They're not necessarily hugely involved in terms of directly impacting revenue, but they are how you actually function as a group. So in terms of your business and operational excellence, and again, these are probably about a quarter of your team. Then you have your consulting and support roles. So the support roles really are there to support the core roles and the critical roles, and actually are really needed on a day-to-day basis. And if they're not there, you definitely miss them, but they're not necessarily directly impacting things like bringing money or funding in or actually getting the work done on a larger scale. But they are very, very important on a day-to-day basis. So again, these are the ways, if you can actually break down whether your roles are critical, core, or support, is a good place to start. Then looking at the actual mapping of your succession. So if you actually mapped out all of your roles, you may have 3 roles, you may have 10. And I know obviously for example, I know there's some of the team from the Donegal Local Development Company here, you each have different programs. So again, if you actually look at team by team based on the program, if somebody was to step away, and I will always use rather than, a very bad situation, for an example, if somebody wanted to jet off on a cruise for 6 months, who can step into their role? And that can be in an acting role, in an emergency role. If somebody was out sick and it was no notice at all, is there somebody capable of stepping into that role? And if there is, what happens to the role that they're currently in themselves? Is there a way like that domino effect that you have people that are readily available and can actually take on the responsibilities required. The next level then is the ready now. And they are people that are ready to move into probably a more senior role, but the role itself may not be ready for them. There may already be somebody in that role. So you don't want to lose somebody who's ready now to take on more responsibilities. So how can you actually keep them engaged? How can they maybe learn from the person currently in the role? How can they actually take on more projects to better support? Then you have development successors. So those are people that could be ready in the next 1 to 2 years to take on a more senior role. And when I'm talking about taking on a role, it's not necessarily moving up in an organizational structure. It can be moving sideways. So you could have somebody that's in a technical role that may move into another technical role. One thing I will stress is that not every technical person is meant for management. And it is the thing is that not everybody is a people person, not everybody is a manager. And I think, unfortunately, we tend to say, oh, this sign of career progression is you suddenly become a manager. But actually, the further up in the hierarchical structure that you go, the further away you possibly go from the work that you love to do. And again, where people are technically good, have specialized skills, moving them away from it sometimes can actually be the downfall of the organization. So it's really to look at the roles that are required, the people that are in the role, and their readiness for other roles. Are there some people that should never move into another role? Are they aware of it? Are they okay with that? We don't want people to get stagnant, but I think it's important to actually look at not everybody is meant to move into something else. The emerging successes are then ready in 2+ years. So that could be somebody who's just joined the organization, but has real flair for a certain area. So you kind of keep an eye on them and go, oh, they actually could be very good. What I will say is just to bear in mind that people do leave. So if you're too reliant on an individual to succeed somebody and they leave, do you have somebody else that's then able to step into that role? So don't just rely on a person, because again, that person may have different aspirations. When you're looking at, I suppose, the people that are in your group, there's one tool which is called a 9-box grid. And it looks not only at the performance, but it looks at the potential. So you could have somebody that is at the top left-hand corner, which says potential gem. So they've high potential and low performance. What that means is realistically, they're relatively new to the group. So they could have great potential to take on much more responsibilities, but they're not there long enough to really gauge what their performance is like. The other end of the scale, then, where you have somebody who's low potential and low performance, they've probably been there for a long time. They don't show any potential for any other role. So you do have to ask, if they've been there with low potential and low performance, how have they been supported? Have they actually been put through any support plan, performance improvement plan? Have they even been informed that they're not performing, they're not showing any interest or potential for other roles? And again, quite often we can get stuck into a groove of just plodding along. We may have aspirations to do things, but the people we work with feel that we're not engaged. So again, it's all down to communication. When you're looking at the top right-hand corner, which is a star, high potential, high performance, these are people that are really ready to move into the next role. So what I would say is, when you're looking at this, and you'll see it in the ebook that I'll share with you, is where do you place yourself? So it's all well and good having an idea of other people, but where do you see yourself in this 9-box grid? Do you see yourself as a core player? Do you see yourself as a potential gem, a star, maybe a risk? If you can actually identify where you see yourself, I think that's probably the first step. Because again, before you start focusing in on others, you need to focus in on yourself. The high potential planning then is looking again, going back to what I said about that organizational makeup. What are the roles? What are the teams? Who are the individuals? How does the organization function? What works? What doesn't? Have you done a risk assessment? Are there flight risks? What are your future needs? And then looking at your succession preparation. Who can step into roles in a short term, longer term? Who's ready now for more responsibilities? Who's in development and who has high potential? So this is then where the high potential template comes in. And again, what I would say is, when you're looking at your org structure, is try not to focus on the individuals, on the personalities in your group, in your organization. Look at the roles first. Because again, if you're doing a succession based on personalities, it can be very subjective a decision. Whereas you need to look objectively at the roles that are there. Are they the ones that best support the organization's mission? Looking at the categories, are they a critical role? Is it a core role? Is it a support role? Then you look at the individuals. Who is currently in that role? Are they likely to leave? Are they likely to be promoted? Are there other avenues that they themselves are wishing to explore? And then if they did leave, who can then fill in? I would tie that element in with your performance assessments. Now, I know there's a lot of text here, so I wouldn't expect you to be reading it all, but I'm not sure how often you carry out performance assessments, if at all. And what I would say is now is a brilliant time to start looking at actually your performance reviews, tying in your succession planning, but also then tying in your values. Where do the values sit when you're doing performance assessments? And where do you actually note that the people themselves are holding themselves accountable for their performance? Most people like to think that they'll be in the 4s or 5s. Some people can be very harsh on themselves. But where people see their performance, is it being matched by their line manager? Is it being matched by the rest of the team? The future skills mapping, and I'm aware that this is a lot of information to throw at you, so you will get the recording, you will have me talk you through this again, and you will get the ebook. So for those that aren't able to attend the masterclasses, if you're interested in attending masterclasses in the future, let Martin know and we can organize some more. But I think this is a way to try and just get you to take stock and to reflect on the organization before you start to focus in on the people. Looking at the future skills mapping again, if you look at your strategic goals, maybe you don't have a strategic plan, but if not, why not? What are the things that you want to achieve in the next 3 years, 5 years, the next year, the next month? How do you actually ensure that you're looking at what are the capabilities that you need to reach the goals? What capabilities do you want to preserve? Do you want to develop? Do you want to get rid of? Or what ones do you want to add? And it's a hard thing to actually figure out, because you might go, well, I'm not sure what capabilities, but it could be that you're looking to bring in funding streams. So do you have a fundraiser? Do you have somebody that's focusing in on developing relationships with your funders, looking at grant opportunities? It could be program development. So again, what capabilities are required? And then you look at the individuals in the roles to see, are they matching the requirements? If they're not, what tools and supports can you put in place? And then if you don't have those capabilities internally, how are you looking at new recruits? What skills are required? How can you actually ensure that if you're looking at you need certain skill set in by a certain time, are you planning appropriately? Have you explored various recruitment channels, such as LinkedIn, your jobs notice boards, recruiters, the wheel, your networks? If you know that you need to focus in on a project or a program this time next year, what are you doing to get the right people in place by then? Do you have the funding for the role itself? And then looking at mentoring, training, and development. For every role, and I think for every group as well, it's always a good thing to do an induction. So again, this is a refresher. Have you looked at your strategic plan? When was the last time everybody did? Have you really reflected on the mission, the vision, and the values? Have you done an assessment with everyone to see, are you all on the same page? And then looking at that kind of induction of where you want to go forward. And then ultimately a career plan. Is there a career within your group, within your organization? If there's not, then at what point do you feel somebody has reached the limit of their, I suppose, capabilities for the organization? Can you help them move on to the next step outside of the roles? And then the one thing that we need is time and money. So again, when you're looking at your strategy, what skills do you require? Can your current staff fulfill those future needs, and where are the gaps? When do you require those skills? When do you need to start recruiting? How much training is required to upskill your current staff? And do you have staff that may be exiting in the coming years? What will it cost to replace them? What will it cost to keep them? Or what will it cost to let them go? And then ultimately, how much money do you have to invest in this, whether it's recruitment, or training and upskilling? But also a really important factor is to look at how much will it cost your organization if you don't invest? How can you ensure that if somebody leaves and you don't replace them, does it have a huge impact on your money, your funding, and your operations? Is it a critical role that you're letting go? Is it a core role or a support? So again, looking at the roles themselves and then looking at the individuals. So what you've done to date is your history, but what you're now working on going forward is your legacy. So what is the legacy so far of the work that you're doing? And how can you now look at the legacy that you've yet to build? This is when I suppose the key aspects of succession come in terms of handing over your vision. So where you may have family businesses, where there may be community groups, voluntary groups, do you have any charter agreements as to what the plans are for handing over? Do you have long-term visions discussed? What's your vision versus what's theirs? How can you come together to actually work together for that long-term vision? Have you documented your systems and processes? And also, have you looked at the development plans? And again, look at your stakeholder review. Have you engaged with your members, your funders, your volunteers, your board, your team, your beneficiaries? What's their experience? What do they think the future of the work is? Who do they see leading it forward, and how do they want to be involved? And then how are you mentoring the next generation? Now, I know it's incredibly hard when you've got founders, and some of you may be founders, but how are you preparing to hand over your wealth of knowledge to somebody else? How do you ensure that not only are you handing it over, but you're allowing them to continue on your legacy? It's not that you're handing it off and you're letting it go and you've lost your purpose, but actually you could be part of the actual elder element of really mentoring that person as they take on the reins. So it's not a way of exiting you out of the group, but it's actually how you can be part of shaping the future. And then accountability. So again, where you have committees, how are you actually holding the succession plan to account? I would recommend that you actually have specific committee focusing on succession planning, strategic review, and development. If you try and get everybody involved in it, it can get a bit too noisy as such. But you really want to ensure that you create a succession plan, but you have a committee that's holding it accountable. Have you identified mentors within your group? Can you yourself be a mentor? What kind of training do you need to do that? Have you engaged in mentoring in the past? Are you also considering how can you be mentored? So have you got somebody that you can speak to that can help you guide so that you're not in it, in the thick of it, all alone, but that you're actually able to voice your concerns, get some fresh eyes and fresh ears to help you move forward. Stretch assignments again for people. How can you actually give them something that actually helps them expand their capability? And then looking at appraisals. So in your performance appraisals, how do you actually include succession as a part of that? What are your plans for them for the future? What are their plans for the future? And then what development plans are you putting in place to ensure that you're also looking at the strategic review and planning to go forward? So the final step are the next steps. So we have 3 weekly masterclasses coming up. Next week is looking at understanding your organization. So to look at the actual structure, the roles, the values, and the culture. I believe that there are still some places available on it, so please connect in with Martin if you haven't yet signed up. The week after then is actually looking at mapping out your succession. So there will be work for you to do in between each session so that at least you can come and we can actually really tease it out to make sure that you're then leaving the call with kind of more focus on what steps you next have to do. Then looking at developing your people plans. So what are the things you need to do? Is it creating mentors? Is it assigning kind of a buddy mentee system? Is it looking at training and development or projects itself? There's an ebook I'm going to share with you. And also then the templates are within the ebook, but we'll break the templates down one by one. There's one-to-one mentoring support that you can avail of. As I said, you can check in with the Carmichael Centre. They have mentoring available. The Wheel also have mentoring. A lot of networks have mentoring. I myself do mentoring as well, but that is at a fee. So I would say is that look and see what options are available within your current networks. And then look at the stakeholder analysis. Are you prepared to do a review with your team, with your stakeholders to find out what their experience is? And then ultimately engaging with your team. Sit down with them. Can you have a conversation? What's working, what's not working? But actually listen. Don't be the one to lead the conversation, but actually invite them to have a say. Inevitably, there will be some people that may kind of be the ones that talk the most, but actually try and see, can everybody have a say? Can you do surveys to get their feedback anonymously? And how does that help you better understand where you're at right now, but also where you can get to next? So that is me. It's a lot of information. I am aware of that. So please feel free to look back on the recording and actually have a thought about what are the questions that are really coming to mind. But for now, Martin, I'll ask you to stop the recording so we can actually take some